Hey class, thanks for jumping in. I'm glad you're part of this online lecture called Conflict in the Christian Community. Up to this point in the class, it's been obvious that I'm drawing from a couple of different places, venues if you would, for my stories. One is the therapy office, and I've been careful to point out that without using specific names of individuals, because I can't do that, that conflict happens a lot in significant relationships. It just does. Um, the the part that I want to press into for the next few moments is how devastating conflict in the Christian community can be and has been for a number of individuals, and that's the other pool of resources, if you would. That's where I also draw a lot of my stories, obviously. There's no doubt that some of us know of individuals who can report to us, maybe they're good friends, maybe they're family members, maybe they're parents, who knows, that got started with a pretty good faith journey. In other words, we're really connected in some way, shape, or form to a Christian community. And then something happened. And I even know of individuals who gave up on the faith because in their particular Christian community somebody didn't get treated fairly, or money didn't get handled wisely, or something happened on a staff level. Maybe there has been some issues of sexual impropriety. I mean, there's just a lot of stuff that gets attached to this. And so I think I was telling you before, I used to call this particular lecture why church conflict is so devastating, because it is. And it's devastating for a number of reasons. One is, and let's be real clear, most of us kind of expected a different level of fighting, maybe a more mature level of conflict management when we chose, or if we chose, to be a part of a Christian community. In other words, we see how people handle their conflicts out there in our work worlds or whatever it might be, but we've been kind of surprised, even disappointed, and maybe devastated at the fact that good Christian people often don't fight fair. I do recall being profoundly disappointed when back in the 1970s, when I decided to take my faith seriously and played church league softball and church league basketball with a group of believers, and I figured, hey, this is cool. Here's one opportunity. Here's an hour and a half during the week where I won't hear the kind of language that I heard at the dormitory at University of Northern Iowa, or here's one opportunity that I'm going to have to watch how authentic people disagree with a call made by an umpire or referee without using some rather interesting language. But that didn't happen. It didn't tank me, but it sure surprised me. It really surprised me that people didn't really have a handle on fighting fair. So anyway, conflict in the Christian community. Down through the years, I've tried to keep somewhat of an idea, some potential reasons, if you would, as to why unfair fighting, or why conflict is so prevalent in the Christian community. There is this mistaken yet rather naive idea that because a group of people choose to follow God or choose to follow Christ, that they won't get into fights, which that is naive. But here's a number of things that I've discovered. I particularly remember going to a church and intervening in that church. I can't remember exactly what the presenting problem was, but their core identities were at stake. And here's what I mean by this. A lot of us are part of church communities, Christian communities, where people have a real stake in not just the existence of the church, but the future of the church. It's often marked by, this is my church, or it's often marked by my father or my grandfather were they were married. They poured the footings. They poured the footings of this church, and I'll be darned if I'm going to let somebody come in who didn't even know my father, didn't even know my grandfather, and come in and change things. So when we could have a discussion at a different time about how change is pretty unsettling, but a lot of times parties' core identities are at stake, meaning this is their church and this is where they find their identity. And you and I both know we find our identity as Christ-following people through Jesus Christ and who He is, but a lot of people just find their identity in their church. We've talked about this in class before, about sealing the exits. It's interesting to watch the dynamics, for instance, of small towns where if you don't like what's going on in your church, it's kind of difficult to drive 43 miles to a different church. And so a lot of people just give up. And what I do when I intervene in these smaller churches is this: I seal off the exits. Now, I'll tell you where I got this particular intervention. I got the language from a book by Harville Hendricks called Getting the Love You Want. But I got the example from a church in Iowa that I visited a number of years ago, and come to find out, when they weren't getting along, they would actually literally seal the exits. They would lock the doors of the church, and they'd pull everybody in together and lock the doors of the church, saying nobody's going anywhere till we get this bad boy figured out. Well, that's against the law. I don't even know what B would be, but C, it's not bad in terms of saying, nobody's going anywhere until we get this figured out. I'm aware of a church, for instance, that they've gone through just a ton of stuff in the last few years, and the new pastor, he uses different language, but he basically seals off the exits. He's put into place a number of strategies to, rather than people bolting and going to the church up on the hill and leaving everybody with all that unfinished business at the existing church, he actually will not allow people to come back into the church until they have apologized and confessed and done all the stuff that you're supposed to do anyway when you leave a group of people. And he also makes them take membership classes all over again, which is interesting for people who bolted and then want to come back 15 years later and have to go through membership classes. Just interesting. So churches don't seal the exits, and they should, but not literally. I personally, you guys, I don't see a demon around every corner. That's not what this is about. But Ephesians chapter 6 is the real deal. In other words, Paul's really clear. We don't struggle against principalities and powers. We don't struggle against flesh and blood, but he says we struggle against principalities and powers, which I think is Paul's way of saying you have no idea what's going on in the spiritual realms when people are fighting. An interesting sidebar to this, and I don't know if we talked about this in class before or not, but what's interesting about this is also in the book of Ephesians, I believe chapter 4, Paul makes an interesting statement about anger. He says, don't let the sun go down on your wrath. Now, people take that literally and say we have to solve all our conflicts within 24 hours or before the sun sets, which I think that's just unrealistic. But what Paul is saying is there really should be a timeline. There really should be a shelf life to your anger. How long that is, I don't know, but here's my point. The very next verse in that chapter, when Paul says, and don't let the sun go down in your wrath, he then says, he makes an interesting statement, and he says, and don't give the devil an opportunity. Now, again, there's not that much devil talk in the Bible. There's plenty, but Paul plays the adversary card there by saying, listen, it seems like, well, he didn't say seems like, it really does give the adversary an opportunity to kind of muck things up if you stay angry longer than you should. So I'm just telling you this because though I don't go into a church and get out any sort of graphs and try to chart and graph what's going on spiritually here, I've been involved enough to know there are times when I walk into a situation, this happened a number of years ago, where my chest tightens up and I'm feeling like, wow, this is really weird. This has got some funky dynamics. And though I obviously don't see the demons around, I can just feel the spirit of anger and of hatred and of rage going on. A number of years ago, right before I was ready to go into a particular setting, my chest tightened up right out in the parking lot. I just felt a real heaviness. It actually scared me, and I don't really get scared over these things. And I called my wife and asked her to pray, and she prays all the time about everything anyway. But she made a comment. She says, well, you don't get scared. And I said, I know, that's the deal here. And sure enough, she prayed, and I walked in, and the church was just a mess. Not logistically or whatever word I'm looking for, but emotionally, people were so angry at each other, and they're yelling at each other, and there was a motion made from the floor within 10 minutes to fire the pastor, and it was just kind of some unbridled anger, if you would. So there are spiritual forces at work. A number of years ago, Henry Nouwen, who is also one of my favorite writers, Roman Catholic priest who finished his life coming alongside those who were less fortunate, if you would, some of them dying of AIDS. But he wrote a book when I first started my doctoral work called Wounded Healers. And he is of the persuasion that the best people helpers, the best pastors, the best priests, the best therapists, whoever, are those who are wounded healers, meaning they've taken a look at their own woundedness, they've taken a look at their own hurts and dealt with them, and turned that around and framed it up in ways to heal others by the grace of God. Somebody took that book and twisted the title to point out, and it sounds harsh, but it's true. There are unhealed wounders out there in spiritual leadership. Those who are using church or spiritual leadership to exercise and for the venue of their narcissism. Very controlling. Those who probably really have gone through some pretty difficult stuff in their lives, and rather than deal with that and process that and confess that and receive healing from that, are using the church or whatever ministry venue as a place to do their work. And the writer calls them unhealed wounders. That sounds harsh, you guys, I know, and I don't want you looking at your spiritual leader, whoever that might be, and say, I wonder if he's a wounded healer or an unhealed wounder, or I wonder if she's really got a lot of unfinished business. Don't do that. All of us in spiritual leadership have stuff that we're regularly working through. All I'm telling you is a lot of times conflict just emerges in church situations and in ministry venues because whoever's in charge hasn't dealt with their stuff, and it gets really, really weird sometimes. Sandra Wilson's right. The church really should be the place, and really is the place, where hurt people should be able to come and to receive healing and receive help and receive spiritual guidance and all of that stuff. But she points out that sometimes hurt people, which is why, for instance, you would expect that in a church or in a ministry venue that would be the place where there would be much more healing. Well, please remember, people come to church do in large part not just for guidance and direction, but they really want their wounds healed. They really do want help. But a lot of times, before they can get the help that they need, they hurt other people. And I stole this from Sandra Wilson, who wrote a book by that title called Hurt People, Hurt People. She's not necessarily talking in that book about church, though she makes a couple references to it. She's just saying sometimes hurt people, and you need to be aware of that. Legalism, people offer different definitions to this. Legalism isn't the existence of rules and laws. Some people mistakenly go into a system, and because there are certain leadership standards or covenants of conduct or whatever it might be, they think it's legalistic. No, that's not legalistic. The officer who wrote me out a ticket because I was speeding not too long ago wasn't being legalistic. He was just telling me to follow the rules, or it would cost me another $180 next time around. But legalism, you guys, is me making conclusions about your life when you don't follow the rules, or me subjecting you to a lot of human constructed rules, and you don't follow them, and then I make these sweeping generalizations about your life. Oh, she must be living in sin because she hasn't been at church, goofy stuff like that. But the reason I put in this PowerPoint that it's toxic is because it is. That stuff spreads. I remember intervening in a church out in Michigan where the new pastor I mean, this is one of the weirdest things I've ever run into, and I need to tell the story now or I'll forget it. But it was interesting how when I pulled up to the park, I was supposed to speak in this church and then intervene later on in the day with some leaders. But I pulled up into the church, and I could hear women talking out in the parking lot, men and women both. But it was interesting when I went into the church, women weren't allowed to speak. True story. They weren't. I mean, if they were around kids or were teaching kids, they could talk. But in the presence of men, they needed to be quiet. And when I kind of kick that around a little bit and ask some people what the heck is going on here, the pastor had implemented some rules based on the authority of a scripture verse. I wish I knew where it is. Well, I'll find it someday. That women are to be silent in the church. End of story. There you go. So that's legalism. It's goofy for one thing, but it's legalism, and unchecked, people do start to believe that if they follow the rules and you don't, that God kind of likes you more if you keep the rules, and a lot of judgments about not keeping those rules, which is just kind of interesting, I guess. Undifferentiated leadership, we talked a little bit about that. A lot of churches also, rather than getting in there and mixing it up about the amount of triangling going on, the unspoken rules going on, who's in charge, who really is formally or informally in charge. What churches will do, and other religious organizations will address the symptoms. Let's just get a new pastor, or let's just put a new wing on this building, or let's get involved in something that's symptomatic, if you would. I asked a church one time. It was a beautiful structure, but the people inside the church really didn't like each other very much. I said, what's going on here? And they said, well, we one person just admitted when we aren't doing very well, we find projects to do. We find things to keep us busy. Now, that's symptomatic and not systemic. And then, what's interesting is this: there's most religious organizations, churches, whatever, really, I mean, they have paid people on staff, but there's some really funky power structures, because what are you going to do? What are you going to do with the Awana leader who's volunteered for this position for years, 33 to be exact, but he starts saying things to people that are just really inappropriate for reasons really nobody knows. Could be mental health issues, who knows? But what do? Do you fire the Awana leader? It's pretty hard to fire a volunteer. And so one of the potential reasons why it's just so prevalent is the power structures. One, they're voluntary, and it'll always be that way, but you need to put some things in place to say, hey, can you stop saying this stuff to kids and adults? It's hurting. So it's kind of a funky. I'm going to put in Moodle. I'll tease these out more in Moodle, so you'll know what I'm talking about. I'm not going to take each of these dynamics and roll them out like I do in Moodle. You'll at least have the PowerPoint with you. But it's really important, not just in church, but it's really important to you students who are either right now or thinking about being involved in a higher level of mediation. It's important for you particularly to know what am I stepping into here? And no metaphor intended, but what am I stepping into? And I don't recommend you take this little piece of paper and say, "Ooh, I think I'm involved in a contest or a disagree." No, but it really is important for you, particularly if you're in a position of leadership, to say, "Okay, am I dealing with a simple problem that needs to be solved? And if we do this right and we speak to each other instead of about each other, um, I think we can. I think we can figure this out." There are disagreements, which also, you're still within that realm of, if we do some good and godly processing and implement some good and godly processes in terms of how to handle this stuff, we're still okay. But it starts to get weird, or weirder, when there's contests. You start to hear language like, you hear a lot of God talk, which you would expect in a church, but when they're fighting, you start to hear language like, it just seems like Satan has a hold on that person. Or I hear language like, wow, the God God seems to have given up on this person. Or I don't know. I'm trying to find exactly the right language. But when you hear us and them, God on our side, not on theirs, when you hear some devil talk, not like the devil talk I just talked about a few minutes ago, but Satan really has a hold of them, or then you're probably in a contest, and that moves, if it's not dealt with correctly, moves to fight and flight. In other words, I'm gonna hunker down here and I'm gonna fight through this bad boy, or I'm out of here. I'm disappointed to report to you all that a good share of the conflicts that I intervene in have already gotten to level 4 and level 5, sometimes level 3. But I don't know what it is, folks, but sometimes churches are just afraid to bring somebody in from the outside. Maybe because they charge too much, but mostly because, we should be able to figure this out. Well, sometimes you can't, because as you read in Difficult Conversations and in other books that you've been reading, when you're in the midst of the conflict, it's tough to see your way through. It's tough to see it objectively. And so this happens quite a bit. And again, when I'm called into a situation, I don't say, "Oh, we got a level 4 going on here." That'd just be crazy. But what I do is take some time to analyze what are we up against here. What are some of the things that I'm having to well, my dog right now is in a conflict. Lucy, that's enough. Kind of a level 3 going on right here. Anyway, I'm looking at the situation and trying to figure out, is this an intractable situation? I never use that language with people. I never say, we're screwed here. This isn't going to work. We got to cut our losses. But there are some situations that I move into and I say, we have an intractable situation. We have a situation where, rather than pretend like it's not as serious as it is, it's very serious. And we need to consider some other ways to deal with this. Lots of things raise the anxiety in congregations. I stole this list from one of my mentors, Peter Steinke, who's written a number of books, one called Healthy Congregations. He wrote another book that I finished reading not too long ago called Congregational Leadership in Anxious Times. He's just really good. And he lists all the things that get people a little bit riled up. Money, And this doesn't always mean we don't have enough, but money. Jesus was spot on. The love of it is really kind of what gets people in trouble. And so a lot of times when money is spent, okay, we've got the far end of the continuum, for instance, where there's embezzlement, and I've dealt with a couple of those situations. But and that's kind of a quick read, like, well, you shouldn't have done that. But it gets really dicey, for instance, when somebody wants to spend like $5,300 for a new drum set, a new trap set, maybe a surround gig, and contribute to a greater bass level in the congregation, when I wasn't even in favor of that in the first place. That's what I mean by money. Worship styles. Sure be nice to go back to the way it was back in the day. Well, back in the day it wasn't all that good either. So, but people will often want to go back to Egypt because the music is different. They want to go back, and I guess I understand that a little bit, but worship is worship, and God doesn't have a vested interest in one style over another. Though I can build a pretty good case for the fact that he's not all that fired up about country western music. But anyway, and Lucy just agrees with me. She just barked. Issues involving sex and sexuality. What's interesting, I remember getting, I didn't use this language back in the day, but I remember coming to an awareness that, wow, you can't just talk about sex within Christian circles, or at least church circles. I was a youth pastor, and I remember, believe it or not, I was like 112 years ago. And there was this series that just came out by a guy named Dawson McAllister, where he, it was a video series, VHS video series, where you sat the young people down and you stared at a screen while he talked about issues of sexuality. And I was all prepared to show this and to lead into some discussion with young people about this. And one of the guys in church just carte blanche come up and said, nope, that's not going to happen. I said, what's not going to happen? He said, you're not going to show that video series. And he was in no position of authority over me other than the fact that he had a daughter in the youth group. And remember, the issue is never the issue. But I didn't know that back in the day. So I get in this discussion / argument / contest with this guy. Tell me why you don't think I should show this Dawson McAllister video. Church is not the place to talk about sexuality. Yes, it is. If it's not talked about here, where are we going to talk about it? And he says, well, then we'll talk about it at home. And I said, do you? And then he walked away from me. And that was good. But anyway, issues involving sex or sexuality. On the far end of that continuum, folks, you've got sexual impropriety, sexual crimes, affairs, all that stuff with members of staff. You've got, Roman Catholic scandals. You've got situations, the Jimmy Swaggart, all that stuff. You look at that and say, oh, I get it. But no, I'm talking just what raises the anxiety in congregations is just even talking about healthy sexuality. I was speaking on healthy sexuality in a church not too long ago, and I actually, when I speak on issues of sexuality in churches, I typically use a number of Bible passages, one of which is 1 Corinthians 6:16, which reads in the Message translation, sex is more than mere skin on skin. It is as much spiritual mystery as physical fact. I mean, fascinating way to frame up that passage. But a guy in a church at a talk I was giving on 1 Corinthians 6 just stood up, closed his Bible, and said, "That's not what my Bible says." And I know enough of what I'm doing to not say, "Well, what does your Bible say?" I knew I had hooked into some stuff that he just didn't want to talk about. And it wasn't about translations at all. But you wouldn't believe how big that Bible was that he was carrying. But anyway, he closed it up, walked out. And I've picked up enough pieces in my day to kind of know how to deal with that, and we talked that through. But issues of sexuality, just they don't. Once in lots of churches, some of them that even you all go to, they do a good job of addressing issues of sexuality, but it still raises the anxiety. Senior pastor's leadership style. Well, she used to do things this way, and now you do it this way. He used to really call on all the people in the church who were sick, but the new person doesn't, and that kind of bothers me. That kind of stuff. You hear that. Old versus new, growth versus survival. There's always a mystery, not always, but often, a mystery surrounding why did they really leave? Why did that staff member really leave? Come on, give me the real answer as to why they're gone. Well, I typically recommend that staff people, when they leave, do not frame up their leaving in God's will talk, but to typically stand before people and tell the truth. I'm going to this location because it's closer to my mother, or I'm going to this location because at the point in my career I actually need a little bit more money and they pay me more money. That really is okay, and it doesn't take all the mystery out of it, but there's just a lot of anxiety sometimes when a staff person resigns or there is a staff conflict. And churches fight about, should we be concerned about the people within these four walls or the people outside the walls? And that's like asking what wing of the airplane is the most important one. I mean, you do need to pay attention to the people within the four walls. But when you take some of those energies and begin to say, we'll not only pay attention to you, but we'll pay attention to the surrounding area, the culture, if you would, people get a little bent. So anyway, internal and external. I'll just put this up here. We've teased some of this out already, but what I particularly want you to pay attention to, the bullet point, is as much as when two people get married, they're merging, if you would, two families and two family systems. When people come to church, you got family systems all over the place. Not just the existing ones, but you've got family and social backgrounds and temperamental differences. We've talked about this, and I think I have sufficiently maybe offended, if not alienated, some of you by saying people fight differently in different parts of the country. When I was pastor out in Colorado, we fought differently than we do here in Minnesota. It's just different. But errors in perception. Hopefully you'll get a chance sometime to hear my wife talk about this. She's done a ton of work on how she calls it the scene behind the scene, but basically it's just a lot of work on understanding that what you think you saw may not have been true. But I was there. But yeah, your emotional brain kicked in, and you believed that you really do believe that you heard the pastor say this, but there's a possibility he really didn't call your mom a name, or whatever. Differences in style, self-protection, all of that.